What role does trauma have to play in bladder and pelvic conditions? These days, there's a lot more awareness of the impact of traumatic experiences on the body. There's a lot of pop psychology content and there's a lot of intrigue about how the two combine. How does trauma impact the body? And that can be really helpful. It can also perpetuate a lot of myths. I wanted to take a moment to reflect on specifically the impact and role of trauma in the context of pelvic and bladder conditions. Reflecting on my conversation with Dr. Lindsey McKernan, a psychologist at Vanderbilt University, who specializes in neuropsychology, so psychology applied to people with urological conditions. And joining her was Saoirse Nash, who is director of Live UTI Free and a health coach, and also has her own lived experience of both recurrent UTIs and endometriosis. It was a really enlightening conversation. Lindsey is a long-time research collaborator of mine. I was excited to be able to explore with her some of her really groundbreaking research around the role of post-traumatic stress disorder in a condition like interstitial cystitis or bladder pain syndrome. So Lindsey talked a little bit about how when she conducted some research at an integrated clinic that she works in of women presenting with interstitial cystitis or bladder pain syndrome, she identified that 42% of people presenting met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. That is nearly half of the people that were presenting at the clinic, which is really quite striking. And it gives rise to the question of what is the role of trauma in these conditions? It is established in the research that early life trauma can have a massive impact on the likelihood of going on to then have some kind of pelvic pain condition, including bladder pain syndrome or interstitial cystitis. But what we acknowledged in this episode was you are also much more likely to experience trauma if you have a condition like this because of the nature of the condition, but also presenting to the medical system where there can be a lot of medical trauma. So we explored, which comes first, trauma or pelvic condition. And much like the chicken and egg situation, it's very hard to disentangle. But Lindsey did a really great job of clarifying the relationship between trauma and pelvic conditions. In fact, Lindsey shared with us more research that she'd done, which looked at a large cohort of people with interstitial cystitis and chronic pelvic pain. And what she found was those that had experienced life-threatening trauma in childhood and were also under recent stress had significantly higher pain, higher healthcare utilization, and more widespread symptoms of pain outside of the pelvic pain condition and perhaps systemic symptoms like fatigue compared to those who had experienced the same childhood trauma but weren't under recent stress, and also compared to those under recent stress without early childhood trauma history. So what that means, if we break that down, is that there is this interactive element. Having early childhood trauma can prime the experience of worsened symptoms or pain, especially when activated by experiencing stress and that might not be psychological stress, that might be from injury, from illness, from infection. The two kind of interlock with each other to then result in this increased pain and symptomatology. But it shows that it's not one or the other. Childhood trauma can prime later symptomatology, but also experiences of acute stress or ongoing stress in the present are also likely to have an impact on the exacerbation of pain and symptoms. So what we're seeing is there's this underlying physiological process of the experience of extreme stress, which makes sense in all of the research that we have and psychobiological insights, where our neuroendocrine systems are disrupted when we're experiencing ongoing stress. And this neuroendocrine system underpins so many other processes and regulatory functions in our body, including how our central nervous system is functioning, how our brain's processing, what our immune system's doing. And all of those things can interact, then have an impact on not just pain, but what's happening in our bladder and other organ systems. So this finding really makes a lot of sense. And it also takes the emphasis off whether trauma had to be in the childhood and of a specific nature, or whether it's happening now. It's more really understanding. Instead, we see that our psychological experiences influence our biological experiences. And if we take that into account, we give the body a better chance of coping with what's happening and potentially recovering from it, depending on what the symptoms are and what the circumstances are. And Saoirse's experience that she shared with us really fit this research. Saoirse had experienced repeated UTIs in her teens. And then when she experienced this huge increase in stress with the passing of her mum and becoming a full-time carer for her brother, that's when symptoms really kicked off, and she started to get the chronic UTI symptoms. And then later, the endometriosis symptoms started to ramp up too. This is a real representation of what happens in the body, that the body becomes more taxed by physiological factors, perhaps predisposed physiological factors or physiological factors that come in later, again, maybe due to infection, illness, injury, contact with pathogens, and interacts with being taxed with broader circumstances and stresses. So bereavement, the stress of being a full-time carer and the elevated responsibility, these things combine to then impact on the body and how it's responding, and unsurprisingly result in increased symptomatology. And what I'm always keen to explain to people when I'm formulating with them in clinic is this doesn't mean that the symptoms are psychologically caused. It means that there is this interaction going on between biology and psychology and social experiences that is ongoing at any given moment for all of us. And when we recognize that these psychological and social experiences are affecting our physical levels and what's happening in our body, we are in a better position to then help our body out and work with it where it's at and how it's being depleted, or finding out ways to nourish it and replenish it to help it deal with all of these things that might be happening. And of course, working out our degree of control of that doesn't always mean trying to target the stresses that are impacting us. We don't have control on many of the stresses impacting us, but we do have potential choices and options for how we replenish and how we tend to our body and how we re-nourish ourselves psychologically and emotionally to counterbalance. And that's often where we don't have very much support or training in what that looks like. And that's often where health psychology support can come in. But it doesn't always have to be therapeutic support. It can be in the form of safe social relationships that are replenishing and nourishing, where you get permission to look after yourself and to tend to yourself when going through adversity. And this brings me on to another really resonant part, which was when Saoirse was saying it's really hard to heal a body that you hate or feel is actively working against you. And I couldn't agree more. One of the foundations that I work on with people is trying to change that relationship of adversity and battling with your body to one of nourishment and compassion, which can be really hard when you feel betrayed by it and you're getting all of these tough, severe physical symptoms. Saoirse was so articulate in reflecting how when she started to change that relationship with her body, other things opened up and she was able to find a new way of relating to what was happening to her physically and find new avenues for supporting herself and replenishing her body. This was a sentiment that was echoed by Lindsey too. What Lindsey was reflecting was often we don't realize how much we absorb and expect of ourselves and our bodies and try and subjugate ourselves to the demands of the world around us and people around us. And she gave this example of a woman that she'd seen in clinic who had really severe urinary frequency, was back and forwards to the toilet multiple times a day, 60 times, I think is what she said. She'd had multiple surgeries and she'd never once asked for leave from work. When she said that, I was blown away because I was just wondering how one person is able to go through so many surgeries, that degree of frequency, and still not ask for any time off. I completely understand the fear around how a workplace will respond and the pressure that one can be under financially if that feels precarious. At the same time, it really reflects just how little space she felt she had to look after herself, to tend to what was happening in her body, to take some time to heal and to recover. to work with her body, and all of the energy that must have been taken up with that process of healing and having to go to the toilet so frequently. So when Lindsey was sharing this story, I was thinking about how naturally our brain tends to default towards self-subjugation, not really recognizing what our bodily needs are, not really recognizing the degree of demand or stress that we're under. And this can be really adaptive for us, especially in the society that we live in, which is generally one where there's a culture of pushing and achieving and deferring rest and pleasure until you've done the thing that you need to do and produce something. It is advantageous in lots of ways to not really check in with your body in that sort of cultural environment. So you keep going and you're on autopilot. But the problem is this starts to stack up and have a real impact on your body. It relates to something called allostatic load, which is this cumulative wear and tear on your body when you're not tending to what it needs. And so there's inadequate opportunity to replenish, recalibrate, restore your bodily balance so that it can adequately heal. The immune system can do its thing. You can come back to a healthy baseline and your body can engage in that important reparation that it needs. We're so socialized to ignoring our bodies until they're really screaming at us that it can be really hard, even once you become ill, to find that balance again of tending to your body in a particular way. And actually, once we've been knocked over to the other side of things because of illness or pain or unexplained symptoms, what we tend to do rather than automatically think, oh, I need to tend to my body and nourish it, we feel like we're in that battle with our body. So this is really, really important when we recognize being tipped over of my body's not complying, I hate it, I'm at war with it. The much healthier, more helpful and productive way of relating to that is finding a way of gentleness and compassion so that the body can find its equilibrium again and so that it can restore and replenish. Lindsey suggested one simple solution for helping you with that is, would you be expecting a friend to do this? Would you be asking this of a friend? In this context that you're in, with what you're dealing with what you're coping with, would you be expecting your friend to do what you're expecting of yourself or what you're expecting of your body? And I think just that simple question can really help you to renegotiate these automatic elevated expectations of yourself and your body and find that way towards compassion, which can be a dirty word to a lot of us. This discussion naturally gave rise to a shift that Lindsey talked about in terms of going from being reactive to responsive. This distinction is something when I first started exploring changing my relationship with my body, when I was doing a lot of mindfulness practice and going to mindfulness groups. This is a theme of one of the weeks in a traditional mindfulness-based stress reduction course, responding rather than reacting. When we're reacting, we're automatically activating and we're not being at all intentional or mindful or gentle. It tends to come from quite an activated space, which isn't necessarily the most helpful for us, for our body and for those around us. And it can lead us to do things that are impulsive or destructive or push ourselves harder than is helpful for us. Whereas when we are able to spot those patterns, we can create a little moment of pause and spaciousness to be a little bit more mindful and check in and find a course of action or a way of responding that actually better serves what we're experiencing in that moment. A concrete starting point that Lindsey gave for this was just starting with self-monitoring, not self-monitoring in a way that's hypervigilant and alert and looking out for what you're doing wrong. A gentle checking in with what's coming up for you, how you're feeling physically, how you're feeling emotionally, recognizing urgency and patterns that might not be serving you, and having multiple opportunities in a day to see, is there space to do things slightly differently? Or is there experience that's coming up for me today that means that maybe I need to pay attention to something a little bit more or do things slightly differently? It sounds simple, but what I find in my clinic when I'm working with people is when I set this as a home practice, and I can set this in all kinds of ways. I can set it in terms of giving people a visual diary that they're filling out and they're color coding things and they're putting in scores. I can give it in a way which is just them setting little moments of reminders to check in, or in a visual way of checking in with their nervous system state. There are so many different ways that we can just start this self-monitoring what I consistently see is on the first go, not many people do it, or they do it so infrequently that it feels like, there's no real point to this. And so we have this conversation about, why didn't you do it? What was the barrier? What was the blocker? And it's not at all judgmental. It's curious, because if it's very hard for you to even remember to check in, that's our sign that it's even more important for you to check in, and building up elements that will make it easier for you to do that and to access that. That might be setting timers, that might be having little prompts in certain ways, that might be tacking it on to other things that you do in your day to have that check-in and making it feel meaningful. Because if you're not having those moments of just checking in with your body, checking in with what's happening with you, then it's really hard to interrupt any existing patterns that aren't serving you. Saoirse's route of working differently with her body was yoga, which was for her an incidental finding. She turned to yoga as a way of engaging in movement because she wasn't able to do things that she'd used to have done before because of her symptoms. And what she found, surprisingly to her, was a new way of relating to her body, of getting into her body in a way that felt safe. And this helped her identify a way of listening to her body and working with it in a completely different way than she had been before. And certainly I recommend some kind of somatically connecting exercise or practice to get in touch with your body in a different way when I'm working with people who are experiencing pain or difficult symptoms that are causing a lot of disruption to their life, because this is a real anchor to starting to change that relationship with your body. When you have a more harmonious relationship with your body, things start to feel a little bit safer, other options and choices open up, and that provides a good foundation for your brain and your nervous system to start processing things slightly differently. These shifts might seem small, but over time, they really stack up and they can really make a vastly different landscape, which then can have a massive impact on what you're experiencing physically and definitely how you're experiencing things emotionally. So many people with bladder and pelvic pain have learned to function despite extraordinary difficulty. And that solidifies the expectation that you ought to just keep going and keep pushing and that there's no other options on the table. And this can serve you to a certain point until your body's got nothing left. So this is a invitation to just start taking stock of what you're asking from your body, how you're treating it, what your relationship is like with your body, how you treat your body when you're feeling different emotions, how you process those different emotions and what impact that has on the body, and seeing what changes from there. The goal isn't to lower expectations of yourself. It's to soften the way that you respond to yourself. And there's good evidence that when you do that, your body starts processing things differently, and that can pave the way for symptom relief or reprieve. If you're interested in learning your body's signals and changing that relationship with your body gently, not hypervigilantly, but just starting to monitor curiously, having those little check-ins, and you want some support doing that, you might be interested in Samira, which is an app that syncs with your Apple Watch if you have one, which takes physiological data from your body and gives you nudges at times that you specify. Through this process, you start to build this bodily awareness and you start to build the ability to respond differently to your body. There are details in the show notes. If you haven't listened to the full episode with Lindsey and Saoirse, I would strongly recommend that you do. We talk about so many more things, as well as trauma. We talk about the role of emotions in bladder and pelvic symptoms. We talk about what coping looks like and how we navigate these very difficult personal journeys and the realities of what that really looks like. It is one full of tips and insights and personal reflections, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Again, the details are in the show notes, and I will see you here again soon.
Learned something today? Your brain hasn't finished with it yet. Research shows revisiting new information is all it takes for your brain to start connecting the dots on its own. So subscribe, listen again, and let it do its thing. Thanks again to our partners at Convatec Continence Care. Don't forget to check out the resources and references linked in the show notes. If you found this episode helpful, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast. It really helps to connect the podcast with those who will benefit most from it. This podcast was produced by Maya Sounds and Music.